For all the attendees out there, your computer screen should look something like this. You have your GoToWebinar control panel. On the right-hand side, some of you might have it on your left. You can adjust your audio mode to use your mic and speakers or use your telephone. For the panelists, you can put your hand up or hand down if you have a question, and I will help respond to those. And then if you have questions and you can't use the chat room, you want to enter them down here in this orange box. So just click on the questions tab, enter them down there and send it through. You can also send feedback to some of the questions that you'll get throughout the presentation, or any questions that you want to ask Frederic, Marcella, or myself during the session. This is the chassis room and what it'll look like. It's tinyurl.com/SteveKatieWebinar. The direct link to that is in the chat room, or you can type this in. You should set up your screens to view like this. So you'll have your chat room on the right-hand side, your webinar viewer on the left-hand side, or vice versa, whatever you're comfortable with. And so, but you can have both windows open. You can see our parallel chat and look at the slides from the presentation as we're moving forward. If you can't use chassis, there again is where you can ask questions. Some people already have submitted some questions, so I'll be getting to those shortly. And I see that the people are coming into the chassis room, so that's great. We're going to do a couple poll questions just to get started and see where people are at. So the first one is, in which part of the world do you live? If you live in a place that's not listed on our questions, please enter the other. Please select other and enter that in the chat. And so everyone's voting. Right now, about 66% of you voted. Just going to give it a couple more seconds. All right, so as you can see, 34% of us are from the Americas, 65% of us are from Europe. So good evening to all of you in Europe, and good afternoon or maybe late morning for us in the Americas. The next one is, what perspective do you bring today? And so are you an internal leader, an external consultant, a student, a teacher, professor, scholar, or an other activist or leader? If you do want to add clarity to your choice, you can also put that in the chat room. We're just going to give a couple more seconds for that, and then we're going to go ahead and get started with our session. All right. And as you can see, there's 24% are internal leaders, 44% are external consultants, 13% are students, 8% are teachers, and 10% are other activists. One of the panelists has to go on mute, getting some reverb, or turn their audio down a little. All right, so thanks again, everybody, for being here. We went through our polls and kind of went through who was here. This is Nexus for Change in the Leadership and Change magazine, present Emerging Organizations, Wholeness, Purpose, and Self-Management with Frederic Laloux, who's the author of Reinventing Organizations. And let's go ahead and meet our panelists. And Marcella Bramer from the Leadership and Change magazine, why don't you get us started? Introduce yourself.
Marcella is...
Oh, I was going to say you go first, Frederic, but that's okay. I'll go first and keep it short. Hi, I'm Marcella Bramer. I'm the co-founder and the editor of the Leadership and Change magazine. and we are a digital magazine for professionals, consultants, coaches, and leaders, and we are about positive leadership, culture, and change. Because we believe that positive leadership is needed, that we need inclusive change and cultures of kindness. So our articles are very much have this positive emphasis, as well as they have a very personal angle. So we want to have authentic, real people who share what they care about and what was difficult in everything they encountered. And we want to inspire you to make a difference in the workplace. So that's why we also have pragmatic articles, because everything is easier said than done. So the big question, of course, is how do you apply this? And that's why I'm really, really glad that Frederic Laloux was willing to do this webinar with us and Nexus for Change, because Reinventing Organizations is one of the best books I've read in the last time. And it's really great to see what this entails and to have a discussion about how we could apply this, because this is the future. Now the stage is all yours, Frederic.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. So my name is Frederic, and indeed a year ago this book Reinventing Organizations came out, that it is based on a number of years of research that I've done that started really from this deep intuition that there's got to be better ways to organize, to come together at work. I guess I felt that over the years I'd done a bit of a personal journey, even a bit of a spiritual journey, and that somehow the perspective I had landed seemed suddenly to be quite far away from where most businesses were at, and I just felt sort of all levels, heart, head, and soul, that the way we think about management today feels increasingly outdated. Maybe I should take over the screen, John. Is that okay? Should I transition into the presentation?
Yeah, that sounds great. So let me go ahead. Wait just a second.
Okay. Let me try this. If it works, if we have enough bandwidth, I can also enable the webcam, and maybe you can tell me. I don't see the chat, but if this is distracting or if this is helpful, I can imagine it might be more active to actually see somebody talking than just seeing slides. So you guys tell me, if there's any reaction, whether this is a good idea or a bad idea.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. We'll keep you posted on the chat room.
Okay. I actually won't see myself because I have to have the slides full screen. So if I'm out of the image, or if I'm forgetting that I'm being filmed and I poke my nose or something, just let me know.
Yeah, and so far Jeff, Beverly, and Andy both said yes, it looks great, and it's nice.
Okay, that's great. Feel free to say the opposite too. Yes, I have this sense, especially now since the book came out, and I get some opportunities to speak, that pretty much everyone somehow shares this impression that management, as we think about it today, as it's being taught in business school, as we practice it today, just increasingly feels lifeless, feels constraining, feels outdated. There's all these polls that show that people at the bottom of organizations' employees are dispirited, aren't engaged at work. But I think there's a sort of dirty secret in management that those of us who do coaching know, is that most people at the top of organizations, so those people that we think are all powerful and have it all and have exciting lives, most of them are tired too. They're tired of the rat race. They're tired of having to, to play the politics. They're tired of having to try to motivate people. Tired of having to make the targets. And it seems like we have a sort of management model that nobody is happy with. And when I say that, I mean that not only for our large corporations, but pretty much all organizations. I mean, teachers are leaving schools in droves, and even though it's it's a professional vocation, because our schools have become sort of horrible machines that we just process children through, and doctors and nurses are leaving hospitals in droves because hospitals have become these bureaucratic, lifeless machines. So it seems to affect all of our organizations, and maybe strangely enough, I actually think this is good news in the sense that I think we're feeling the pain of an old model that is dying. And actually, if we know where to look, we can actually already see the new model appearing. What I've done over the last 3-4 years is research organizations that have been founded by leaders or existing organizations at some point were taken over by a new CEO who felt that really they wanted to just pretty much throw out everything we know about management because they didn't believe in it. It just was hurting their integrity. They wanted to do something else, and it's of course much easier to say what you don't want than actually than to determine what do you want. And so after much trial and error, some of them ended up with an entirely new set of management structures and practices that proved to be incredibly more powerful, more soulful, more inspiring than the traditional model that we all know. And what got me really excited in this research of case studies was to see the often striking degrees of similarities in what these different people ended up with. Even though they're in very different countries, in very different geographies, industries, and each of them thought they were the only crazy fools really trying to invent a new model. And yet, after trial and error, they ended up on remarkably similar things. And I really believe that we're touching there something that is just wanting to emerge, kind of a next stage in management. And when I say that, I know that this might trigger two voices in us. It certainly did with me. There's one voice, I think, for many of us that says, hey, yes, I hope this is true. There's got to be a better way. But then there's also often a somewhat more skeptical voice that says, like, hey, can we really sort of radically throw out what we're being told in business school and invent something new? Is that really possible, or is that just wishful thinking? And I won't spend any time really on this, but I just wanted to show you, this often overlooked fact is that every historical period in human history had its very own management model, its very own organizational model. And every time we made a leap from one age to the next one, we came up with real breakthroughs, with a fundamentally new and more powerful way to be in organizations. So for instance, the organizations in the tribal age were very, very crude organizations that couldn't scale at all, where the boss needed to exert fear and violence at all times, for the organization not to disintegrate. And then when we made the leap to the age of agriculture, suddenly we came up with one breakthrough, which we now take for granted, which is the org chart. People just conforming to their boxes. And suddenly the levels of violence dropped dramatically, and organizations became much more stable and scalable. And I won't go through all of these breakthroughs, but basically, every time we made a leap to a new age, we came, with a number of fundamental breakthroughs and a new organizational model. And so, in many ways, it's not unthinkable at all that we might come up with a new model, because it would only be basically the 5th time that this has happened in the course of history. Right? So these are exciting times for us that live in this age of transition, but this is in many ways not exceptional. We've had these kind of transitions before. Let me very quickly share you the story of one of these organizations I researched. So I looked at 30 to 40 organizations in total, and then I zoomed in great depth into the practices of 12 of these organizations. And one which is, particularly beautiful one to tell is Buurtzorg. It's an organization in home care in the Netherlands, so nurses that don't work in a hospital, but take care of sick people, old people in their homes. And I find it an interesting story because it so well demonstrates kind of the leap from one management model to the next. Very quickly, if you imagine being a nurse in a traditional organization, not Buurtzorg, but a traditional organization in the Dutch market for home care, this is what your day looks like. You start in the morning with a sheet of paper you received the previous evening, where somebody in a planning department in headquarters that you've never met has made a plan for you for the whole day, and says, hey, at 8 o'clock you start with this old lady, and you are supposed to change her 2 compression stockings. And you come in, you actually scan a barcode that is affixed to the door of that old lady, so that a central system can capture your productivity. You have exactly 5 minutes to change 2 compression stockings, 2.5 minutes per stocking, and then you're out. So hello, change the stockings, goodbye, you're out. Then you have 3 minutes to drive up to the next patient. The system calculated that, and at 8:08, you're supposed to give a shot to that gentleman, and that takes 10 minutes. And so at 8:18, you're out again, and you have 6 minutes to drive to the next patient. And that way, the whole day is calculated for you, right? And if you lose time somewhere, the system will sense that, will flag that, that information will show up for your manager that can then have a discussion with you to try to optimize, whatever procedure that you're not doing within the time norms, right? And it's a system that has proven to be very, very efficient, but it's also a system that nurses hate. I mean, they've just become these, robots that are, just giving care to plan and trying not to lose a single minute. And clients hate it because what often happens is that, they see a different nurse coming in every day because, sort of random staffing of whoever is closest by. The nurse looks at the sheet of paper and says, oh yeah, you need a shot. And then the old lady says, yeah, that's what it says on paper, but it's a bit more complicated. Let me explain. And a nurse says, no, I'm sorry, I don't have time. Gives a shot and runs out of the door again. And in the midst of that, there's a man called Jos de Blok who had been a neighborhood nurse for 10 years and who felt that, that system just wasn't working. And he created Buurtzorg not so long ago, late 2006, early 2007. And he created it originally just with 4 nurses, and he felt that you should just really trust nurses to know what good care is. And for them, good care is not just to give a shot and change compression stocking, is to help patients live the richest and most autonomous lives. So nurses at Buurtzorg actually sit down and drink coffee with their patients at the beginning and wonder, what is it that you can still do? What can't you do? How could we help you get more autonomous? What's your network of support? Do you have children that live here? Oh, you don't get along well with the children. Can we maybe make a meeting? I'm happy to mediate and see if they could help out, or maybe there's neighbors that we can call on. Right? So they have a very different perspective on care. And the nurses work really without any management in little self-managed teams of 10 to 12 people. And they do all of the management tasks that were before found out. So they do their own planning. There isn't a planning department anymore. And they have enormous degrees of freedom and also enormous degrees of responsibilities and accountabilities. And the result of that is that clients absolutely love it. They just see 1 or 2 nurses that they know very intimately, who truly cares about them. And nurses love it. They've got their vocation back. And the result is that Buurtzorg today, isn't 4 people like it was 6-7 years ago. It's now 9,000 people. more than 80% of all neighborhood nurses in the Netherlands work for Buurtzorg. So they basically grown from 0 to 80% market share. They've just basically evicted and steamrolled competition out of the market. And what's fascinating is that from a medical point of view and from a financial point of view, the results are stellar too. I'm not going to go into the medical, but from a financial point of view, there's been some studies done. There was an Ernst & Young study that found that Buurtzorg uses less than 40% of the hours prescribed by doctors, because they make themselves irrelevant much faster, because patients become autonomous so much quicker. And so Buurtzorg ends up saving the Dutch social security system hundreds of millions of euros every year, which is a total paradox. You know, they actually cost much less, even though they sit down, drink coffee, have time to really talk about care, do family meetings, you know, talk with neighbors, than these other organizations that were trying to shave out 1 minute from, you know, changing a compression stocking or giving a shot. And, you know, these results are absolutely spectacular, but they're not uncommon. I mean, most of these 12 organizations that I research in great depth have the same kind of stellar results that you get when you know, make the leap to a more powerful form of organizing. Now, what are the breakthroughs of these new models? You know, how do organizations like Buurtzorg operate? According to what I've found, there are 3 fundamental breakthroughs that come with this new organization model. You know, breakthroughs as fundamental as the example I gave you when at some point we invented sort of the org chart. And the first one is self-management. So at Buurtzorg, you have 9,000 people, and you don't have a single manager. You don't have anyone in a boss to subordinate relationship. And there are other organizations out there, you know, with hundreds of thousands, with tens of thousands of people, where no one is the boss of anyone else. Right? And that just sets free enormous energies. And this thought, I think, is, at least for me when I started this research, this wasn't something I was expecting. This thought for me was so revolutionary that I really needed to wrap my head around it. Because I had grown up with the idea that, you know, if you have a group of 4 or 5 people, maybe that can happen without a boss. But any group larger than that, come on, you know, at some point you need a structure and you need a boss, right? And what I've come to understand from studying these organizations is that, yes, indeed, when you have large organizations, you need structure and coordinating mechanisms, but no, you don't need a boss, right? And here is, I think, a better way to think about this, is that the pyramid, you know, that's depicted in the bottom of this chart, the good old pyramid with layers of hierarchy, works kind of okay in low complexity environments, but in environments with high complexity, the pyramid just breaks down. The pyramid just can't handle complexity. In our large organizations today, you know, the world is becoming so complex that, you know, however smart the leaders are at the top, they cannot make sense of everything that's going on and make smart decisions. And what you see is that all truly high complex environments that exist in the world work on mechanisms more powerful than the pyramid or traditional hierarchy. They work on systems of distributed authority. Let me give you a few examples. The global economy, right? The global economy is an incredibly complex system. Millions of companies, billions of consumers, trillions of decisions being taken every day. And there isn't a CEO trying to steer it, right? Only Cuba and North Korea, you know, still try to steer this with a central planning committee, and we kind of laugh at them. But we forget to laugh about the fact that we still try to do that within organizations, where, you know, this sort of steering planning bureau is basically the executive committee, right? So in the global economy, you have structures, you have coordinating mechanisms, but you don't have traditional hierarchies. You don't have a CEO trying to steer it all. Or take this picture, if you see it on your screen. This is a picture taken within one human cell. One human cell is of breathtaking complexity. At all times, there's lots of chemical reactions happening and lots of information exchange happening. And all of that functions really extraordinarily well. And yet there's no CEO, no executive committee. There is structure coordinating mechanisms, but no hierarchy. Or take the human brain. The human brain has 85 billion cells, hugely complex system. And there isn't one cell that says, hey, I'm the CEO, and if ever you have any good thoughts, pass them by me and I will approve them. Right? The brain could never do what it's doing if it was working through the bottleneck of a pyramid. Right? So all truly complex systems in the world that exist out there, and there are many of them, they all work on systems more powerful than hierarchy, on systems of distributed intelligence. And what Buurtzorg and some other organizations I researched have found is really the trick of importing the principles and practices that underpin these complex systems in nature and to make them work within organizations. Right? And to do that, you really have to reinvent most of the basic building blocks of management. Right? I listed a few here. So the organizational structure is no longer a pyramid. It needs to be something else. Right? And from the research, we now know there are a number of different structures that allow these more powerful mechanisms to operate. Decision making, it's no longer top-down decision making. Who can make what decisions? Do you still need staff functions? How about compensation? Who gets a pay raise and who doesn't? What happens when there's conflict? All of these things need to be upgraded to a world where you don't have traditional hierarchies, where you can't escalate these things up the hierarchy, right? And what is really fascinating, I think, and very hopeful is that there are enough of these Buurtzorgs out there today for us to actually know how each of these building blocks work. We just have enough examples. We know how each of these building blocks work. So, if you are leading an organization or if you are advising someone who is a CEO that is open for this, we actually know in very practical details how these things work. Right? And so we can make that happen.
Frederic, is
yes,
this a good point to ask a question?
Yes, exactly. I was just going to share that this is the first breakthrough self-management. I was just curious if there were already any reactions to that.
Yeah, well, one of the questions in the chat is from Biliana, and she is asking about self-management. What about public sector organizations? So how does self-management apply to them? And somebody else is saying, oh, it's Biliana again, I fail to see how a ministry, for instance, can do without hierarchy. So what would your response be to that? How could that be possible? Is that possible at all?
My sense is that it's absolutely possible and that we're going to see it happen. I very much believe that we are on a journey where consciousness evolves, and that this is just a few case examples today that we're likely to see many more of those, including in ministries. I think it hints to another question, which is, what is needed to make this happen? And from what I've seen during the research, there's really two necessary conditions for organizations to operate in this way. And the first one is that the CEO wants this, because in our traditional pyramidal organizations, the power of the person at the top is so strong that, if you have a traditional controlled mind CEO to whom self-management just seems hippy-dippy foolish, he will, of course, or she will, of course, never introduce it. So you need a CEO that understands this and wants to make this happen. And you need a board that understands it too and supports it. Otherwise, at some point, they will get scared and they will replace the CEO. And so I think the problem with public administrations for the moment and ministries is that politicians for the moment are pretty risk averse. And that few politicians would want to be associated with something that at this moment feels risky. If anything goes wrong, people will say, hey, yes, that was so foolish to let people self-manage. So I think that's the downside. But otherwise, there's no reason why this can't work. there's some examples of organizations that have, for instance, here in Belgium where I live, there's a very famous example of an organization that hasn't gone all the way to self-management, but pretty close. People evaluate their managers every year, and bad managers just get kicked out. So they have remnants of hierarchy, but the power of managers is gone. People can work from home. Nobody checks working hours in the ministry. It's the Ministry of Social Security, because people just have objectives, and people's performance is just very transparent. So they're getting pretty close here. And what they did is that they played it in stealth mode, because no politicians would have accepted it. And then it became so successful that productivity just shot up, went through the roof. Everybody in Belgium in the public sector wants to work there, and so it's become so successful that now suddenly all politicians want to be seen there and want to be in the picture when it's in newspapers. So it's an interesting story.
So we shouldn't equate self-management with chaos or instability or not being reliable. So you can, like with buurtzorg, they will provide reliable healthcare to those elderly people, even though they self-manage their teams. I mean, I think that behind this question could be the question, how can you provide reliability and an equal treatment for all citizens or patients or whatever your audience is?
So there's many misconceptions that float around self-management, often because people have memories of self-management being tried in the 1960s and where people just said, hey, let's abandon all rules and all management, and that of course proved a chaos. So self-management isn't simply taking hierarchy out of the organization. That's really the misunderstanding. Self-management is really making the leap to a more powerful structure of distributed authority. So it's, you take out a number of old processes that are listed on this slide, but you have to replace them with more powerful versions. So if you simply say, hey, there's no more hierarchy, indeed, then you get chaos, right? So, and that's often the image that we have with self-management. Maybe we need to invent a new term for it, simply because we have all these associations that self-management is just basically like a huge playground where everyone can do whatever they want. In these systems, you actually have a lot of self-correcting mechanisms built in, that as soon as something goes wrong, the system self-corrects, because you don't have, and you no longer need traditional managers or leader to correct it, because the system really has sort of healing powers that self-correct. In the spirit of time, maybe I will switch to the second breakthrough. If there's more questions on self-management, if we have time at the end, I'm very happy to go deeper into this, because I assume that if you haven't read much about this, this is very new. I mean, at least for me, it really took me time to wrap my head around this. The second breakthrough, we can call it wholeness. See, in most organizations today, there is this conscious or unconscious pressure for us to show up in a professionally acceptable way, to wear a professional mask and to check out part of whom we are at the door. And sometimes when I share this, some people say, no, that's not really true. I'm absolutely the same at work than I am at home. And I say, hey, that could be true. But I think in many cases, we have often worn this mask at work for so long that sometimes we even forget that we're wearing this mask. And we forget how much of what is most important to us we often leave behind. And I sometimes like to illustrate it in this way. All right, we all have an ego, and we all have a deeper part, deeper hopes and longing and aspirations. And in most organizations, we learn that showing up with the ego and fighting for our careers, our budgets, and all of that's pretty acceptable. But actually, if we show up from our deeper parts, if we dare to speak up for many of the things that in organizations are hurting us, the ecological damage that we're all doing, this mindless consumerism that we're favoring, this objectivations of patients in hospitals, these outdated teaching methods where we force children to sit down for 8 hours passively and listen to material. I mean, in whatever domains you are, I bet that there's some really deep questions that at some point bugged you, but then you realize it's unsafe to voice them. And so at some point, what happens is that we actually stop listening to that part of us. And I think if we play so many little ego games in organizations, it is because we feel it's unsafe to speak from a deeper part. Just to take another dichotomy, we all have masculine and feminine energies, whether we are a man or a woman. We always have these two energies. And in most organizations, we very quickly learn that the masculine energy, showing up determined and, showing no doubt and being resolute and looking forward and taking the hostages, all of that is very valued. And the feminine side in us, that decides that maybe wants to slow down, that wants to question, that wants to care, that is vulnerable. That side isn't a career winner, and so whether we're a man or a woman, we shut down that feminine side of us, that caring side, and we all show up much, much more masculine, much more determined and resolved, and hide any doubts that we have. And we can go on like this. We all have a rational side, we all have an emotional side, an intuitive side, a spiritual side, and again, in organizations, we quickly learn that rational, that's good. Facts and figures, that's great. Emotional side, no, come on, no emotions. Intuitions, if you can't, prove it, what's that good for? And spiritual, I mean, come on, let's not talk spirit in organizations. Right? And so we end up with this. And this is just a graphical description, but I think it points to some fundamental truth of how little of who we really are we tend to bring to work. And I think if there are so many polls that show that, latest Gallup poll, only 13% of people 1-3 in the world are engaged at work, I think part of the reason is all this dispiriting hierarchy and budgets and pyramids and stuff, but part of it is that we simply don't much like who we are when we are at work. We don't like to be that little side of ourselves. And what some of these organizations like Buurtzorg and others have found is that when we show up with only such a narrow part of ourselves, we also only show up with a very narrow part of our energy, of our creativity, of our passion. And so they've actually put in place a great number of practices that help us to open up that window and to show up in the full glory of our humanity with all of our strength, our doubts, our fears, our vulnerabilities. And what happens then is simply extraordinary. There's a level of passion, of energy, of vibrancy in these organizations that is extraordinary. They're really life full because people just bring so much of life in these organizations. Right? And again, for each of these elements, we know how to do them now because there's enough organizations who show us very practical examples. How do you do evaluations and feedback? In a way where we're not coming from a place of fear, but where we're coming from a place of fullness, of wholeness. How do we resolve conflicts in a way that honor everyone? How can we help each other be whole at work and actually make workplaces places where while we do outer work in the world, we actually do inner work on ourselves as well. Right, so this might be another sort of natural breakpoint. Marcel and John, I don't know if there's any already any comments or questions or related to the topic of wholeness.
Yeah, there is. I have to find it only because the chat room is what we call in the United States blowing up with questions. So it is. What's the that, Marcelo, please cut me off if you see. Oh, what are the connections that create a safe space to show up in our vulnerability, and a space to even show up with our deepest wounds?
That doesn't happen by magic, right? We all know that in most of our communities interactions, the space often doesn't feel very safe. And so what many of these organizations have done is that they've actually really spelled out what it takes to create a safe space and then train everybody in it. Sometimes they have beautiful documents that say, hey, these are all the behaviors we want to see, and these are some behaviors that we discourage, and that we ask everyone to speak up. And they can go to very details. There's one beautiful organization called RHD, and they have a Bill of Rights and Responsibilities, as it's called, a beautiful document, where, for instance, it's just one section, but they talk about, hey, we never want to have demeaning speech or anything that belittles someone else. And so, stuff like irony, like sarcasm, like rolling the eyes in a meeting or something, is all stuff that we simply declare this is something we don't want and we need to speak up. In quite a few of these organizations, everyone is trained in nonviolent communications. And then there's just meetings and places where this gets reaffirmed and reaffirmed and reaffirmed. This is, in many ways, unfortunately, we don't learn this in school, even though we should. And so this is something that we have to reclaim or relearn as adults. And so, it actually takes quite a bit of spelling it out and training and practice to do this. The results are pretty amazing. I mean, there's one sentence, I just want to share this with you, that I heard in several organizations I researched, and I was always, intrigued when I heard really literally the same sentence coming up. And that sentence was, 3 different people I remember told me, sometimes I wish home was more like work. What they meant is sometimes I wish that, in my home there was the same level of acceptance, the same level of listening than I generally find at work. It's really quite an extraordinary sentence to say. I hope that answers that question a little bit.
Frederic, and a question from Amanda. She's from South Africa, and she says we have such high levels of worker apathy over here. So is there a difference between more developed countries and maybe less developed countries, or where people are not used to this?
I don't believe so. I believe this taps into some universal aspect of, us wanting to do good work, of wanting to have some degree of control over our lives. The best example for me is one organization called AES. They are electricity producers. So they basically run electricity factories. And they were started from the start with some of these ideas, and they bought in the 1990s factories everywhere in the world, in more than 30 countries, in Tanzania, in Uzbekistan, in many former Soviet republics, in Latin and Central America, and every time they found that they could apply their methods there. Sometimes it took a whole year or even 2 years to get there, because it's difficult for some people to break out of their apathy. It's been so trained on them. The traditional hierarchical model, they had so few degrees of freedom, so few degrees to express themselves, that it took them time to trust, the new leadership, that the new leadership is actually serious. And sometimes people really go through a learning curve, which in the beginning can be a bit painful. It's asking you to take on responsibilities that you haven't taken on before. And there isn't, you can't blame managers anymore, because, there aren't any managers to blame anymore. So for many people, this is a real growth curve that can be somewhat painful, but for almost everyone ends up being exhilarating. I mean, the percentages of people in these companies that were taken over that end up leaving because they really cannot cope with these degrees of freedom and responsibility is actually very small. including in these countries, developing countries where AES was buying power plants.
Okay.
Let me maybe shift to the third breakthrough, and I think we'll have more time for a discussion at the end.
Okay.
The third one is one that one of these organizations, or rather systems in this case that I researched, some of you have probably heard about it, it's called Holacracy, called evolutionary purpose. And the notion here is that purpose is really, the founding core is really the energy of the organizations. And of course, we've heard this before, companies all have mission statements nowadays, and in many cases we're a bit cynical about these mission statements because they're nice slogans, but they don't always really live inside organizations. In this case, in these organizations, purpose is really central. Let me give you one example. At Buurtzorg, Jos de Blok. Let me restart. If Buurtzorg's competitive advantage compared to traditional home care organizations is simply their operating model, right? The way they organize in these teams of 10 to 12 nurses. The nurses are exactly the same. The material they use, the stethoscope and the syringes, are exactly the same, right? And so if Buurtzorg was a traditional organization, the way they organize is being their competitive advantage, should be their biggest secret, right? That's what no competitor should find out about. And what Jos de Blok did was the opposite. He wrote a book in Dutch where he spelled out all the practices that Buurtzorg use and sent a copy of his book to all of his competitors. And the reason for that is that his purpose is all about providing great care, and having patients live autonomous lives. And whether Buurtzorg ends up with 20 or 50 or 90% market share, in some way he doesn't care. That's not what purpose is really about. And so one of the striking findings is that if you really take purpose seriously, there is no more competition, right? The fact that we talk about competition is because we really place the self-preservation of the organization above its purpose. If you take your purpose seriously, anybody else who fights for the same purpose is an ally, not a competitor. So that part is maybe still kind of easy to understand, but it gets a bit more complex than that. What is really meant by evolutionary purpose is a whole different perspective on leadership and setting a direction. Today's organizations are all predicated on the notion of predict and control. Right? The role of leaders, of CEOs, is to make a great strategy and then to have all sorts of execution plans to make that strategy happen. Right? Is to set a course and then make sure that everybody follows that course. Right? That's what we're being told, and that's what totally made sense for me until I started this research. I mean, how could it be any other way? And what Jos de Blok from Buurtzorg and other leaders of these organizations say is that actually for them, that perspective isn't valid any longer. It's kind of bullshit. Because they say, this perspective that, senior leaders should set a strategy and then execute on that really comes from the idea that organizations are somehow, machines that need to be programmed, right? Are sort of lifeless entities that need to be pushed in one direction. And what they say is they consider the organization from a different perspective, and this is where it becomes really new. They say, we believe that the organization is a living organism, has its own sense of direction, has its own creative genius, has its own spark, its own energy, has its own thing to manifest in the world. And our roles as leaders is actually not to predict and control the future. Our role is to constantly listen to where is the energy, where does this organization naturally want to go? And then we will help it go there, we will dance with it. So it's coming from a place of humility, of actually listening into purpose. And again, this changes quite radically a whole number of management practices that we take for granted today. So to give you an example, at Buurtzorg, has no strategy. And none of the 12 organizations that I researched in depth has a strategy document. It sounds crazy. I mean, these are highly successful organizations that have no clear strategy in the sense of a strategy document. They have a very clear intent of what they feel called to do, but then they have all sorts of other mechanisms to constantly listen and adapt and listen to where is reality and where are we called to, rather than these sort of rigid 10-year strategy, 3-year strategies, midterm plannings, budgets. And most of these organizations don't have budgets, or the minimum budgets that you actually need for some decisions that you need to make. None of these organizations has targets. These are organizations where you have salespeople without targets. It sounds strange, except that there's of course other mechanisms that are in place, that help highlight, how the organization is living up to its purpose. Right? And again, what's fascinating is that there's enough of these organizations out there for us to actually know in quite some detail how each of these things work. So if you are part of an organization that is ready to go there, or if you're advising an organization that's ready to go there, we actually now know in really practical detail how all of these things work. Right? So that's on evolutionary purpose. I'm really just giving you the highlights in this sort of 1-hour webinar. I hope this is good food for thought, and I'm curious, John and Marcella, if there's any questions or reactions already.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of in the chat room. It's really busy. I mean, it's everybody is talking and it's very vibrant. So we are scanning all this text to find some great questions, because there's so much going on. Which is, there's a huge response to everything that you're saying, and that is really great.
There's
you
one
have a question, John? Yeah.
Yeah, there's one question from Thomas and Biliana. They want to know, does wholeness require self-management and evolutionary purpose in order to be present, or can it exist on its own?
Oh, thank you. For some reason, I always forget to say this, that these reinforce each other, but in the research, some of these organizations are much more advanced in some dimensions than others. Buurtzorg is pretty advanced on all 3 of them. But you have organizations like, there's an organization called Morningstar in the US that was featured in a Harvard Business Review article, I think a year or 2 ago. Fantastic organization in terms of self-management. They fully nailed that. But really, wholeness and evolutionary purpose pretty much, isn't on their radar screen, and that's just a reflection of who the founder and CEO is. And you have other organizations that are very deep into the wholeness piece. There's a fantastic network of mental health hospitals in Germany called Heiligenfeld. Very beautiful, beautiful practices on wholeness, and they still have, traditional levels of hierarchy. But the people come so much from a place of wholeness that most of the poison of hierarchy is sucked out of the way they operate. But I still believe they would do well to make the leap to self-management. But in their case, they still have some layers of hierarchy. But these 3 things really play into each other. Just to say, wholeness requires a safe space. Now, when you have traditional hierarchy, you have all these power games, where people have power over other people, that make wholeness that much harder to attain. Now, it's not impossible. Heiligenfeld is a great example. But if you work from self-management, all of the fears of what will my boss say, and somebody can shoot down a great idea I have, or my salary or my advancement depends on someone else, all of that kind of falls away, and it makes wholeness so much easier. Right? Or in evolutionary purpose, it's so much easier to give up on targets and budgets if you're already self-managing. It's not impossible to do that without it. There's a movement that you might have heard about called Beyond Budgeting, that does a lot of this, of getting rid of budgets and targets within very traditional hierarchical organizations. Right? So they they're distinct. You can pursue one more than others, but they clearly play into each other's strength.
Okay. Well, one other question about evolutionary purpose, Frederic, is that somebody is asking who decides what the purpose is. So how do organizations come up with their evolutionary purpose to follow that energy?
In any of many ways. I mean, the whole point is to try to listen to what wants to happen, rather than to one person imposing it, or doing analysis, or the way we think of in traditional strategy terms. So it's not an executive committee that does an offsite and says, hey, this is our purpose, it's our strategy. And there's all sorts of mechanisms to do that listing. Some people have used the theory U from Otto Scharmer. Often what happens is that it's not even a very conscious decision. This might be a beautiful moment to tell you a story from Buurtzorg. Buurtzorg had one team, so one of these 800 teams, that thought, hey, we should do some preventions. Many of our old patients at some point fall and break a hip or break a knee and then need surgery and then they lose some autonomy. And couldn't we prevent some of that if we taught them some good gestures, some good ways to hold themselves, and if maybe we help them rearrange their homes? And so they partnered with some local physiotherapists, and they did some presentations in the evenings, and they went to people's home and taught people how to prevent falling and rearrange their homes, and they felt it was a great success. And they went to see Jos de Blok and said, hey, we think we're onto something. We really think that Buurtzorg shouldn't only be in caring for people, it should actually also be in prevention. Why don't we generalize this across the whole country and not just in our little neighborhood? And if Buurtzorg had been a traditional organization, here's what Jos de Blok would have done. He would have thought about it, maybe analyzed it and hired a consultant, and at some point would have said, yes, this is now an extension of our purpose. We will go into a prevention. Or no, we won't. And if he had said yes, he would have done a traditional rollout plan. He would have set a budget aside and then made a whole rollout plan. Hey, let's do 10 teams as a pilot, and then roll it out to 100 teams per month for the next year or whatever. And what Jos de Blok did was the exact opposite. Basically, he said to that team that came to see him, that was all excited, he said, "Who am I to know whether Buurtzorg is supposed to do prevention? It kind of makes sense to me, but why don't you write up your story, package your approach, put it on the social internet? They have a very active social media platform, and we'll just see if other teams want to follow. And just package your approach, tell them exactly how you did it, so that they can adopt it." And the team did that, and within a year, 90% of the teams picked it up. And so a year later, they just found out, hey, actually, Buurtzorg is now in the prevention business. Basically, it's now part of our purpose, and no one has actually ever decided it formally. There was just energy in the system to go there, and the metaphor that is used for these new breeds of organizations, very consistently by their leaders, their founders, is that they consider their organization as a living organism. Or an ecosystem. And if you think about a living organism or an ecosystem, there's innovations happening at all times at the edges of the system. And if it's a good permutation, if it's a good innovation, it spreads through the ecosystem like wildfire. If it's a bad one, nice try, and it just folds. And you see a lot of that in these organizations, where you just realize after the fact, hey, it seems like our organization has moved here just because there was energy, because that's where the organization was going to, without actually anyone ever really formally listening into it or deciding on it. Sometimes that happens too, but sometimes it's just an organic process.
Okay, thank you. John,
I mentioned all the time. There's just 2 minutes left.
I appreciate it.
To extend a few minutes if some people want to stay on, but maybe we should close it. If some people want to stay on for another 15 minutes or so, I'm more than happy to.
Yeah, Frederic, let's do that, and that'll give us a chance to go through some of the questions. But for those of you who are here, if you do have to get going, if you are joining us for work and things like that, I'm going to take the screen away from Frederic for just a second and bring up our slides just so you know how to interact with Nexus and the Leadership for Change magazine after we're done. So give me just a second. I'll bring those slides up. I was just furiously responding to people in the chat room. There's some great discussions on there and some great questions. So we are going to come back to Frederic. I just want to make sure that that we're doing what we need to do to kind of close out the session. And then thank you, Frederic, for graciously staying on and giving us a little bit more of your time. So give me just a second. So Marcelo, why don't you tell everyone out there a little bit about the magazine, and then we'll do next steps, and then we'll come right back to the questions.
Because, yes, let's get back to the questions as soon as we can. But I didn't want you to miss out on this offer because we're doing this webinar series, but we're also writing about these kind of topics. And I wanted to tell you that, well, I've already told you that we inspire professionals, consultants, and leaders to make a difference in the workplace and the world. That is what we aim to do. And of course, we hope that you will become an annual subscriber for $27 a year, and that includes the digital magazine, the webinars, white papers that you can download from the membership website, and audio interviews. But especially for these, for this webinar and all its attendees, we have an offer that you can get the lifetime subscription, which gives you access to all the back issues and all future releases, everything that we're going to do. For a single payment of $149, we're going to offer that to you for $75. So that's 50% off if you do that by Friday, ultimately. So that is the offer we have. And it's not just that we're selling things, because this is about the topic and the content, and it's really important that we spread more ideas like this of wholeness, self-management, evolutionary purpose, etc. This is really important. So if you go to the URL that you see down there, the bit.ly URL, you will find a free mini magazine to download, and that includes the article, which is a pretty long article with the main ideas of Frederic Laloux's work, so his book. So that is a great starting point. If you don't have much time to read or study in the upcoming period, you can download this mini magazine and read this article, and then you have the gist of what Frederic is saying, and so you can check it out. And I guess John will email this link to everyone so you can find it there. Okay, thanks. That's it as far as the Leadership and Change magazine is concerned.
Thanks, Marcelo. That's a great segue, and yes, this link will be sent out as a follow-up email, as will all of the documents from today's session, including Frederic slides, the Nexus slides that you see here, and the chat room notes that will have all of our discussions and questions. I know there are some folks that were not able to get into Chatsy, and we do apologize for that. Some organizations and some computer networks have firewalls that don't allow them to get in. But bumper sticker checkout, if you'd like, you can. We were going to do what possibilities do you see now that you may not have thought possible before. For some of you that are hanging on, feel free to enter that in the chat room after we go back and finish up with the questions. Our next webinar for the Leadership and Change webinar series is with Marcelo Bramer on March 25th at 1 p.m. And here's the link. That will also be in the slides that come out with to you guys. The NEXUS webinar survey, as you leave, go to webinar, it'll ask you if you'd like to send us feedback. And you do that, and it's a short 6-question survey about the session, and also feedback to NEXUS for Change on how we can better serve your needs for the webinars. And then join us on LinkedIn. There's a link here where you can join us on LinkedIn for a debrief discussion. I'm probably gonna post the chat room notes and have people kind of review them and give some of their reactions. So thanks to all of you for being here, and let's take it back to Frederic.
Yes, I actually don't have the chat room in front of me, so I don't know, John, if you can stay on for another 15 minutes, if you if you want to take one or two more of the the questions, or maybe just comments. It doesn't need to be questions, but
yeah, sure. Some of the comments, and I'll just start reading it at some point during the way. But one of the questions I think that still stood out was, and I'm trying to find it who it was, is what are your suggestions on how they would start this 3-step process? And would they start it at the top with the CEO, or would they start it kind of revolutionary at the bottom and build that way? So what are your suggestions or reactions to that question?
I mean, I'd love it for revolution to start from the bottom, but I haven't seen or heard of it actually really a single example of this being successful when it wasn't supported by the CEO. We haven't gotten into this very much here, but each of these historical steps comes with a very distinct way of looking at the world, with a very distinct worldview. And to be able to embrace this new model as a CEO, you need to think about, you need to have your ego well in control. You need to be able to understand that there's control in the system rather than control in your own power. And so, to most CEOs that I know of large organizations, not all of them, but to most, this sounds totally crazy, foolish. And so if they think that, no matter what you try to stir up below, they won't give up on, hierarchy and budgets and targets and predicting control, basically. So the best shot is really when the CEO is open and when the board sees it that way. Now, that doesn't prevent a middle manager or any leader in an organization to try within his or her bit of the pyramid below them to already do parts of this. In terms of wholeness, there's really nothing that stops you within your own group to try to start to introduce some of these things. You can raise what someone once told me called a shit umbrella. Just raise a shit umbrella, where you just basically play the game upwards, but prevent much of the shit to go down. So, let's say that there's a rigid budget process that you have to go through. Well, you submit all the numbers up, but you actually don't cascade that whole thing down. If that's possible within your organization. So there's a number of things that you can do as a middle manager. You can't change a whole budget process. You can't change job classifications, but you can still do some stuff below. Next time you need to appoint someone below you. Why don't you let the team one level even lower down, write a job description, and interview the person that will be their future boss, rather than you nominating them. It's still hierarchical, but somehow you change that whole power game when the boss has been selected by his subordinates rather than by you. Right? So there's a number of things that you can do even as a middle manager. The odds are, though, that if ever, when you move on to some other place, unless you're being replaced by someone from your own team that is deeply steeped into that, if there's a more traditional manager that comes in, whatever you will have built up, might just disappear. And that's it. So, I still very much believe that these two necessary conditions, a CEO who sees it that way and a board who sees it that way, is necessary for at least, for this to go kind of all the way in the way some of these organizations go about management.
Okay. I saw another question in the chat room. Someone from Israel said, we invented this model 50 years ago. It was called the kibbutz. And, it all went downhill at the first crisis that occurred. Yes. So the question is really, how crisis resilient are these kind of new organizations? Let me phrase it like that.
Yeah, you see that's the really this problem of misperceptions that we have about self-management, that that I see just over and over again is that so many people say, "Oh yes, I know what self-management is. We've tried it. It's the kibbutz, or it's the communes in where in Germany, or it's Mai 68 in France, or it's whatever." Which all had some elements of that, but mostly what they did is that they took out many of the things of traditional structures and didn't replace them with very much in terms of other structures. And so indeed, they weren't very resilient in crisis. They ended up often being these horrible, endless talking shops with consensus decision-making. And, we didn't get into this, but the reason self-management in these organizations works so powerfully is because there's a new decision-making mechanism that is neither top-down, the boss decides, nor consensus. They don't work on consensus. They have more powerful mechanisms than that. And what then happens is that these organizations are actually extraordinarily resilient in times of crisis, actually much more so than other organizations. And we know this because there's enough cases to show it. I mean, there's a number of manufacturing organizations that are part of the research that have gone through all of the cyclic ups and downs, and the way they weather the downs is just so much more powerful. I mean, there's Sun Hydraulics, it's NASDAQ quoted, maker of hydraulic gear in Florida. I mean, they have absurd margins for a manufacturing company. They have margins in the 30-40%, and they have been created in the 1970s on this model, and they haven't had a single loss, even in downtimes. There's the case of Favi in the north of France. They're an automotive supplier. Just like the automotive suppliers, they go through huge kind of ups and downs, and even in bad years they're profitable. And they're the only European, supplier standing for their pieces. All the rest has moved to China. And the reason these organizations are so much more resilient in times of crisis, at least from a financial perspective, is part of it is because they don't have all this, fat, quote unquote. I don't like that word, but they almost have no staff functions. They have no, they have no management. I mean, it's just very, very productive organizations, right? And there's a level of responsibility. There's a case at Favi which I found fascinating. The first time Favi with a new model, so Favi is this automotive supplier in northern France, in 1983 was a traditional organization. New CEO comes in. By 1985, he's completely turned it around. It operates like Buurtzorg in these small self-managing teams. And in 1990, they hit the first major crisis, which is the first Gulf War, and just car orders just plummet. And the CEO, quote unquote, Jean-François Zobrist, gathered everyone in the factory. They just asked, on an impulse, he's a pretty charismatic maverick guy, to stop the machines, gather everyone in the corner of the factory, stands on a few boxes, and says, "Hey guys, I have a problem. We will soon lose money if we continue like this. I don't have an easy solution. The easiest thing would be to fire all temp workers." He says that, and there's temp workers in front of him, right? So here's a daring guy that shows his vulnerability. But by that time, people were so in the know of the financial situations. These small teams are directly in contact with their clients. They know that their orders are down. There's no management to fight against anymore. There's no management to save them. So, the space they're in is very different. Zobrist shares this. There's all sorts of questions, and how bad is it, and blah blah blah. And then somebody raises his hand and says, "Why don't we just work 3 weeks instead of 4? Because we only have 3 weeks of work to do anyway, and we just get paid 3 weeks instead of 4. We do this for a month, and if we need to, we will do this for another month or 2. But in this way, we can keep the temp workers." And then there's some comments, and then it sounds like there's an agreement on this. And Zobrist says, like, "Hey, can you raise your hand if you're in agreement with this?" And everyone raises their hand. And so within an hour, that thing was closed. Everybody was back at the machines, and all workers just agreed on a 25% salary cut temporarily, which sounds crazy in an hour, right? And there's many stories of organizations where these things happen because people just know about the realities and take responsibilities for their lives. And I'd like to contrast that with how this would have happened if Favi was still run like it had a few years earlier. The boss would have secretly, spoken to his head of HR and said, can you make a few scenarios, and then they would have worked out something in secret, and then they would have, spoken with the executive committee, and then, when they make a decision to fire some people, then, it gets decided and executed and, communicated. So, this is just a radically different way to go about this, and so these organizations prove to be much more resilient. But again, it is because they have very strong new practices, unlike some of these attempts that we've had in mostly the 60s, 70s.
Okay, thank you. John, what do you think for the sake of time?
Yeah, I think we got, I think a couple more questions. Is that okay with you, Frederic?
I can do another 5 or 10 minutes, no problem.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, let's do 5. Let's do 5, and we'll do just a couple more questions. Talk a little bit about the shift in power, or the first steps towards making a change like that. How do employees handle that shift in power when they're kind of going through the first steps, and or what happens when the lower levels demand management or demand more of a structured type leadership?
It seems like one thing that is needed for people in the organization to make that shift is that they need to trust the intentions of top management. So if you really are in an organization with a lot of mistrust, people will just see this as another scheme, another change program, something else that these guys up there have devised, and somehow this must be particularly pernicious, this must be particularly pathetic, because they actually pretend like they will hand us over power, right? And so, for instance, AES, when they took over these power plants, the reason they often waited 1 or 2 years to make these changes is they really waited till they felt that people actually trusted them with their intentions. So I think that's a first sort of precondition. What you generally see, that everybody says that has gone through that transition, is that once people at the bottom trust you, they pretty quickly end up loving this. I mean, there might be some growth pain, the fact that you can't complain, that you want somebody to take care of you, and that you have to face the consequences of your inaction. But most people, felt so constrained before that they feel this is like a huge liberation. And it's really for middle and senior management and staff functions that this is very threatening, because suddenly their jobs disappear as jobs. There might be other things for them to do, but they disappear. What you often find is that there isn't enough jobs, to go around for, the middle and senior managers and the staff functions that had accumulated. In some cases, Favi, for instance, in north of France, had so much growth that no one needed to leave, because, people could find other creative work to do. But in other cases, if there is no growth, for instance, at AES, every time they took over one of these power plants, they made a very generous voluntary redundancy package, and so anybody who wanted to leave could leave, and often those who wanted to leave were those that anyway wanted to continue playing traditional roles of managers and having traditional levers of power. So it's really how you deal with middle and senior managers that is often the most difficult question, more so than how you deal with people lower in the organization. There's again a beautiful story from Favi, where Zobrist tried to get his senior managers to accept the change. They didn't, and so at some point he just basically took out all the levers of power. He got rid of the time clock, he got rid of registration systems of how many pieces people made and stuff, and so he basically just wanted to create chaos so that his managers couldn't manage in a traditional way. And he was a bit anxious, of course. He was wondering, what is happening? Will workers still work? He knew that workers were very, trusting him, and wanted to prove that he was right in doing so. But and what he found, the first day and then the first week and the first month is that productivity of the machines actually went up by 15 to 20%, and he just couldn't believe that. And so he went to see the workers and said, "How come productivity went up by so much?" Just because we took out the registration systems or whatever. And what they said is that basically there's a natural rhythm to work on these machines, to load and unload these machines, that is the least tiring for the body. You just settle into a rhythm. And that before that, when there was this traditional management, they actually worked slower than the natural rhythm because they were always fearful that somebody would increase their targets. And so they said, hey, if we're already at this natural rhythm, and people ask us to increase, what will we do? So they actually purposefully worked slower than the natural rhythm. They were more tired. But then suddenly when all these games disappeared, they just worked at their, I thought it was an interesting and fascinating story. The last one?
Actually, what I was going to do is just read some of the reactions to some of the folks out there. So Brody said, thank you, Frederic, for spending some time with us. I found your perspective to be enlightening and inspiring. There were a lot of people that said, thank you so much for the engagement. Patricia said, thank you so much for the engagement. It was an excellent session. Billiana said, thank you for this webinar. There were a lot of folks that were in the chat room that were talking about your book and your Facebook page and some of the experiences that they've already had working with your principles. Zach says, thank you. Paola says, always nice listening to you. So I think with that, let's go ahead and close out the session. Marcella and Frederic, thank you so much, both of you, for being here. For all of you out there, thank you again for attending. We're going to be mailing out, and you'll get it from GoToWebinar. We'll be mailing out all the slides. In the NEXUS slides, you have all the contact information that you'll need for Frederic, his book, his Facebook page, how to get in touch with him and stay in touch with him. And then from Marcella, you'll get links to the Leadership and Change magazine and also to about the subscription offer that she talked about towards the end. And then our next webinar and our tiny URL. So, and then make sure that you guys do fill out the survey at the end. So Marcella and Frederic, any closing words, and then we'll go ahead and end our session.
I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you because I really enjoyed it. It was a joy to see this vibrant community in the chat room. And Frederic, you are so passionate about reinventing organizations. I simply love that. So thank you very much for sharing your inspiration, your sound research, and your energy with us. I mean, we really need this to create a wonderful 21st century workplace. So thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for attending. And go out there and let's change the world.
Yes, let's do it! Woo!
It changed very, very grand, but I feel, what have we got to lose? Really, what have we got to lose? So let's go out there.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Frederic, and thanks everybody out there. I appreciate everyone who was in attendance and all of your engagement and your vibrant questions and reactions. So this is John Spalding with Nexus for Change and the Leadership Magazine present Reinventing Organizations with Frederic Laloux. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.